From handcuffing their fighters with restrictive contracts and unfair fighter pay, to major changes to UFC contracts calling in more restrictions and waivers for lawsuits, here's everything about Dana White's alleged manipulation of fighter contracts. For starters, everyone knows how the UFC loves tying fighters to contracts, with no freedom to choose fights, sponsors, or literally anything. Instead, Dana White's the one making all the decisions around here. And he's not ready to pay his fighters enough either. And that really makes you think whether he's trying to manipulate fighter contracts just to maintain his control and suppress whatever bargaining power these fighters have. And if so, why does everyone still want to sign with the UFC? Well, you gotta admit, White made sure his promotion's the best one out there. In fact, most people who aren't big fans of MMA confuse it with UFC because it's just that popular, clearly. White knows how to keep up his game, even when his fighters are complaining or leaving $8 million deals to switch to other promotions. So, while Jake Paul's talking about unions to bury whatever White's trying to do, the former heavyweight champion Francis Ngannou gave up his biggest payday yet just so he could find a promotion that gives him all the benefits he asked for, while also letting him gear up for his boxing debut. It all boils down to one thing, and that's the fact that the UFC controls everything. Whether that's the pay scale, event scheduling, or even terminating contracts without cause, White's allowed to do whatever he wants, and there's no one stepping up to stop him, because he's also limiting benefits like health insurance, workplace protections, and even the fighter's ability to unionize. And considering how violent fights can get, it's only natural for fighters to be concerned about basic health care that leaves them healthy enough for another big fight. But the UFC contracts are literally one-sided. Sure, no one was there to stand up for it before, but with Ngannou's UFC exit and Jake's rivalry with Dana, you can expect more fighters coming on board with the union idea. Let's be real. How long is White planning to use his contractual terms and negotiations to hold back fighters from looking around for better opportunities outside the UFC? I mean, these fighters can't even take up fighters in other companies, like Bellator. As for White, he hates crossover fights until the right fight comes up with the right money. At the same time, even if they can't fight for any other MMA promoter, they're still guaranteed a minimum number of fights in revenue by the UFC, but that also limits the money they make, and I'm talking in millions. So, yep, I don't blame these fighters for stepping out of line and calling out Dana on his management. Plus, the company keeps the lion's share of the profits, which is at least 85%, and the UFC president dictates the UFC fight cards and always deals with whatever legal battles come his way, even if it's an antitrust lawsuit. And no matter how much Dana denies it, a union is going to be a problem for the UFC because they finally have to fund things like healthcare insurance and pensions and even share in the revenue they've got. But let's not forget, fighters trying to call out the UFC on the insane terms of their contracts don't have it the easy way either. Many of them had to resign at the prime of their career or give up their biggest paydays, and yet nothing happens to the UFC president. But with all the exclusive contracts and champion clauses, are the UFC contracts explicitly against fighters? Well, they all depend on the fighter they're made for, but generally, yes. Just think about it. They've got the power to dictate the fighter's earning potential and career opportunities. And let's not forget the controversy of being a free agent after pulling the rivalry card with Dana White. Something along the lines of what happened to Ngannou, who missed out on his biggest fight yet just because he had reasonable demands that the UFC wasn't ready to accept. And no matter how much money Dana was ready to pour into the deal, nothing was enough to tie down Ngannou any longer. You see, he wanted healthcare insurance for every single UFC fighter, a 3-fight deal, and wanted Dana to waive the extension clauses. But since none of that happened, Ngannou kickstarted 2023 with his free agency. But when a heavyweight champion vacates his belt and cuts ties with the UFC, you know something's up. And let me tell you, no one in the MMA industry took it lightly. In fact, many fighters believe his UFC exit was a huge mistake. But he wasn't free in that contract. He wasn't an independent contractor and had no rights and no power. To top it off, even though he signed an amazing deal with PFL, where he's got a bunch of benefits and the freedom to try out boxing, fighters still think it's a mistake. And even though Ngannou's ready to fight Jon Jones right now, his rivalry with Dana isn't gonna let him. Let's face it, the UFC president can be really petty when he wants to be, and this was no exception. He knows the fight between these two MMA legends is gonna be huge, whether that's the hype or the money. But he still won't give in, all because he wants his piece of revenge from Ngannou. And if that wasn't enough, he knew the former heavyweight champion was going to be after Tyson Fury for his boxing debut. I mean, they've been at it for years, but Dana took his rivalry one step further when he called out the Gypsy King for a crossover fight with Jon Jones, just so he'd back out of his offer with Ngannou. And if there's one thing we know about Fury, it's that he loves bouncing around offers all the time, and negotiations with him can be more troubling than you'd think. But all of that combined is just one example of what happens when these UFC fighters decide to take a stand against Dana's alleged contract manipulation. Is it an abuse of power, or just another business tactic to protect the UFC's interests? If you ask me, considering how he won't let go of Ngannou's career even after his UFC exit, it's an abuse of power. Sure, trash talk isn't rare in MMA, and neither are controversies, especially when Dana's involved, but going back on his statements over crossover fights just to challenge Ngannou's potential opponent doesn't seem right to me. It's pretty clear that the UFC simply can't give up its control over fighters, especially the legends who left their mark. And over time, many fighters came forward to switch things up with their contracts, like Bloody Elbows John, who reported the changes in 2022. And I'm talking about changes like the Sunset Clause that put a 5-year maximum contract length to limit the extension of a contract when fighters were turning down fights and removing the exclusive negotiating window, something that Ngannou took advantage of when he decided to exit the promotion, which would have been unimaginable before 2023. And let me tell you, there are a bunch of other fighters like Paulo Costa who are now pulling out pages from the Francis Ngannou playbook. At the same time, there are others who use the threat of waiting out their contracts just to get a better deal. And with all the major changes to UFC contracts, fighters had to deal with a lot more restrictions, topped with waivers for lawsuits. That's right, if any fighter disagreed with the UFC over anything in their contracts, they couldn't take Dana to court. Instead, they'd have to resolve everything within the promotion, throwing off every leverage they ever had. On the surface, it might not seem like a lot because only a few fighters ever sued the UFC, but now they're taking away a fighter's right to dispute over something in the agreement, which is tilting the playing field even more heavily into the UFC's favor. To top it off, there's a waiver that protects UFC from any sort of action and lawsuit. Clearly, the promotion knows its way out of legal battles after years of dealing with them. And if that wasn't enough, before 2017, there weren't any limits to the number of extensions the UFC could add. And if the promotion offers a fighter a bout and they're not ready to take it, Dana can extend the agreement for another 6 months, or whatever time he needs to find another opponent. Simply put, the contract was trying to force fighters into accepting bouts in fear of consequences, even if they weren't up for the challenge. But is all of that even legal? Well, the UFC was sued enough times for abusing its market power with one-sided contracts, but the Supreme Court of the United States will tell you that none of the new additions can be challenged right now. But one thing's for sure, Ngannou's leading the first wave of fighters who are paving their way out of these restrictive UFC contracts, and it's only going to get more complicated. So, there you have it. From major changes to UFC contracts calling in more restrictions and waivers for lawsuits, to handcuffing their fighters with restrictive contracts and unfair fighter pay, that was everything about Dana White's alleged manipulation of fighter contracts.